Informed Planet Radio.
Informative talk back.
Special guests.
The truth behind the lies. Your input.
Your music.
Our planet.
My planet.
IP Radio.
Sit back. Get ready for another informative session in the live room.
You're on IP Radio.
Welcome to Informed Planet Radio. Today we have adoption activist Evelyn Robinson today here with us.
Hello, Fred. Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Very good. And we're going to be talking about many topics, around the adoption topic, I guess. So it's not just about just outright adoptions here. This is about the laws and what's right and what's wrong, what has been and what should be, I guess. So, Evelyn, how did all this start for you then?
Well, my son Stephen was born in 1970, which was at a time which in America they refer to as the baby scoop era, which is when if you were young and unmarried, the prevailing view was that the best thing you could do for your child was to give the child up for adoption, and the child would then be adopted by a married couple who could give your child all the advantages that you couldn't. It was a time when it was considered shameful to be pregnant and unmarried, and where there was no government financial support that would allow an unmarried mother to raise a child on her own. So unless the father was going to help in the raising of the child, or the young woman's parents or family were going to help her raise the child, there really were very few options. And there was also the belief that children raised by a single parent, well, at that time it would be a single mother. It would have been very rare for a man to be raising children at that time. But the prevailing belief was that any child raised by a single mother would no doubt be disadvantaged and would probably even turn out to be a juvenile delinquent. Child psychologists and social workers all said that trying to raise a child on your own was irresponsible because it would not be in the best interest of the child. And if you were pregnant and unmarried, you'd already done the wrong thing. So there was a lot of pressure put on unmarried mothers to now do the right thing and try to make things better by making sure that your child had all the opportunities in life that you couldn't give them. Mm-hmm. So my son was adopted, and we were reunited when he was 21. Mm-hmm. Before we were reunited, I joined a support group for mothers whose children had been adopted. And I actually went through a course of counselling, which was excellent. It helped really well to prepare me for meeting Stephen again. And it helped me to understand myself and my own experience so that I could better explain it to other people. Because I, like many other women, kept this a secret for many, many years. We were told that people would look down on us if they knew, and it was so difficult to talk about that it was easier just not to talk about it. So, as I said, like many mothers, I didn't talk about it for a very long time. And after having counselling with someone who understood the issues, I was then able to talk about my experience to other people.
Mm-hmm. Now, this started back in Britain, and you're now in Australia, but this was common throughout the Western world, would you say?
Yes, certainly. In my fourth book, I've published a collection of mothers' experiences from Australia, New Zealand, England, Scotland, Ireland, Canada, and America. And they're all from roughly the same period in history. And the reason I did that was to let people see how similar the attitudes and experiences were in the major English-speaking countries. I'm sure similar situations arose in other countries, but it's not so easy to get information from those places. These countries, it's easy to get information from. And so lots of mothers sent me their stories and gave me permission to publish them, just so that people could see that these were not isolated incidents, that these attitudes were prevalent in all of those places. And they came very much from the churches, because the Christian churches believed that sex before marriage was wrong, it was immoral, and therefore women who were pregnant and unmarried were looked down upon, and they were pretty much blamed for having become pregnant. And a lot of the churches actually managed homes for unmarried mothers, where the mothers would go and spend a large part of their pregnancy there. Sometimes they would give birth there, and they also operated as adoption agencies. So the church would then find what they thought were suitable parents for the child.
So basically the mother's just, sent away to be forgotten about for 9 months and hidden from society because of the embarrassment of it. And that's really sad, isn't it?
It was tragic. It was a major tragedy. And a lot of parents, the parents of the unmarried mother, were so ashamed to have an unmarried mother in the family that they actually arranged all of this. They arranged for her to go away.
Yes.
And they made up all kinds of stories. She's gone to live with her aunt, or she's got a job in London. The Irish mothers often were sent to England. Sometimes the English mothers were sent to Scotland. Australian mothers were sent to New Zealand. The New Zealand ones were sent to Australia. American mothers were sent to Canada. So all kinds of complicated...
That's right out the country. That's not just send them, into the country area of the hills or to the next town over or something. Let's let's just remove them from the country. Yep. That sort of scenario, which is quite extreme if you think about it.
It is. And it did happen to people. And when you hear some of the complicated things people went through, if a young mother wanted to write to her own mother, for example, sometimes the mother would say, if she lived in a small town, "Oh, but I can't have a letter coming from you, from that place, because I've told them you're in a completely different place." And people did things like, using false names, disguising their handwriting, or they would send a letter to somebody who lived in another place and ask them to send it on. All this subterfuge, all this cover-up. It was really incredible, the complexity, the lengths people went to cover this up.
So there would be, still a lot of people who were adopted and probably have never known their whole lives either, or have known it and it's just not even talked about within the family because it's just, kept a secret, or, some family members know. But I'm sure there must be many scenarios where, children have probably, been born and been adopted out and lived their life and died and not even known that they were ever even adopted, because most children wouldn't even question if that was your real mum and dad, especially if you were handed over at birth. You'd have no memory of anything beforehand. And as long as you were, I guess, as long as you didn't look radically different to the parents, then, who's to say,
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Lots of people have grown up and never been told they were adopted. Sometimes they find out when their adopted parents die. And maybe they go through paperwork and find out then. Some people, I'm sure, have lived and died and never been told. That's less common nowadays, of course, because legislation was changed so that adopted people could find out about their past, when they became adults. And so adoptive parents started to think, oh, my son or daughter might hear about this that they can find out this information, and it's going to look really bad if I haven't told them. So, in more recent years, most adoptive parents would be honest with the children.
We are becoming a lot more of an open society, an open-minded society as well. So, it's a lot easier, I think, today to talk to children about more sort of world issues, because it, with the internet and with the media and TV so common now, not much is hidden from our children anymore. So these issues and these topics are known about by children these days, at least. So,
but that wasn't the case years ago. People were very protected, and for the mothers, a lot of them felt and still feel, because their children grew into a time where standards and expectations were so different, that they're afraid that their children who were adopted won't understand what it was like, when they were pregnant. Because nowadays, a child is born, they don't write illegitimate on the birth certificate anymore, and that's what they used to do. If the parents weren't married, they wrote illegitimate on the birth certificate. And I've seen some of those from, researching my family history. They don't do that now.
It's demeaning in a way as well.
Well, it gives people a different legal status. Legitimate children and illegitimate children had a different legal status, where now we've abolished all of that. We don't do that anymore. And if someone has a child... And the other thing was that when I was pregnant with Stephen, I had to go to the maternity hospital, but I wasn't allowed to attend the antenatal classes because I wasn't married.
Oh, so you wouldn't be... Well, the antenatal classes aren't just looking after the child, it's going through the pregnancy and the breathing and everything.
Exactly.
So to them, it didn't matter whether you or the baby survived. Is that sort of what they're implying here?
Well,
without, we don't want you to have help.
Yeah,
So
you were
just fight yourself.
Yeah, you were really a second-class citizen. And that was a form of discrimination, although we didn't realise it at the time. But you can't discriminate like that anymore against people who aren't married. But the feeling was that, again, you had to be hidden somewhere, and you couldn't come with all the other married women because you were different and you were shameful, and you couldn't come and mix with them.
Now, a lot of this wasn't actually law, was it? It was more pressure from the church and society, which is the other sad thing, that it wasn't forced upon, with a written document because it's law. It was just forced upon because of the beliefs of the old age and the old ways. And it's good that we got through that.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, as you say, there must be a lot of grief involved. With children wondering who they are, who they belong to, looking for their own face within a family that's not related to them. And there'll be parents out there that have always been lost and never known. My wife's mother is in the same circumstance. She adopted out a child, and she hasn't made much effort to try and find her, because I think, I just believe, I don't really want to put too much words into her mouth, but I really believe that it's embarrassment as well, is that she doesn't know what to say to that child, why she gave her up. I mean, some counselling would obviously help in this situation, and someone to actually explain and help her take the blame away from herself, because I know the situation, the exact same thing happened with the parents and with the church, and forced her aside and forced her to give her up. And they've had no contact, nothing. So, I mean, there's obviously a child out there as well, running around going, who are my parents? Yeah. Both of them,
And a lot of mothers are afraid that it will be just too hard to try and explain what happened, and that the child will blame them and be angry with them or hate them or not understand, or because, as you said, attitudes have changed so much over the years. I spoke to an adopted person a couple of months ago, and this is a man in his 50s, and he didn't know when he was very young that he was adopted. I'm not sure how old he was when he found out, but he says, when I look back, he said to me, when I think about it, nobody was ever happy on my birthday. He said, and I could never work out why that was. I kind of thought, well, maybe they don't like me or something. But he said, it didn't. I never thought for a minute that I might be adopted. He said, but I just knew that there was something uncomfortable going on every year when it was my birthday. Nobody was really happy and really celebrating. And then he said, well, later when he found out he was adopted, he said, well, that all made sense. Because it was obviously uncomfortable for his adoptive parents because they're celebrating the day of his birth and they weren't there. You know, his adoptive mother did not give birth. But everybody's saying, well, this is the celebrating the day of your birth. And he sensed that as a child, but had no idea what this discomfort was about.
So for people that would be looking to find their birth parents or their adopted child, how would they go about that? In general, I mean, I know it's probably different in each country. But is there a general process that this is simplified through, or is it still complicated?
Well, Australia has really led the world as far as this is concerned. We are still way ahead of lots of other English-speaking countries. As I said, I can't speak for any of the others that I don't know about. And in Australia, this is a matter for the states and territories. So depending on where you were born, there will be the different law in South Australia compared to Victoria or Queensland. So in Australia, you would have to go to the state that you were born in and find out what the legislation is there. In other countries, everything is slightly different depending on where you are. The place that has the least accessibility to information is America. It's very hard in most states in America for anybody to get any information about an adoption. They've been fighting and struggling for more openness there for many years. And they've had some small victories in some places, but it's still extremely difficult. We're much more open in Australia.
Well, so for those wanting to help change them laws over in America or wherever they be, what kind of steps could someone as an individual take?
To change the laws?
Yes.
Well, it requires...
I mean, I know that, we're only one person, but is there, do you know of any petitions to sign or things like that can help?
You can certainly find things online. But in America, again, it's a state matter. Well, there are 50 states in America, so each one would be in a different place as far as this goes. And that's how it happened in South Australia. It was the people who had been affected by adoption who lobbied the government. They talked to members of Parliament, they got up petitions, they wrote to newspapers. They did all of that to get the laws changed in South Australia. And we were the first state in Australia to do that. And the other states and territories pretty much followed South Australia's lead. When it comes to the particular legislation that we have, in some parts of the world, they tend to be much more generous, if you like, to people who are adopted, because they still have that idea that the adopted person is the innocent person in all of this. The mother, of course, is guilty. She was always going to be the guilty person.
Yes.
She was always going to get all the blame. So in quite a few places, they are fairly generous to adopted people because they think, well, they've got a right to have this information. They didn't do anything wrong. It wasn't their fault. But South Australia was the first, as far as I know, was the first place in the world to pass a law where mothers and the children who were adopted had equal rights to access information, a legal right. So in South Australia, if you want information about an adoption that's taken place in the past, you go to the relevant department, and obviously there's paperwork and what have you, and the information is legally available to you. Now, at the moment, unfortunately, some information you can be refused some information, and that's something that I'm very much hoping will change this year. Our current Adoption Act is being reviewed, and I've submitted my ideas to the review, and one of them is that we no longer have that ability to restrict the release of information. So I'm hoping to hear before the end of this year that is the case. But in other parts of the world, in other parts of Australia too, it's much harder for mothers to get information, or traditionally it has been. And in the United Kingdom, for example, mothers have no legal right to any information about their children. So, for example, if you had a child who was adopted there and the child had never been told they were adopted, you as the mother can't try to find them to let them know.
Right.
You have to rely on the child looking for you.
Okay, right. That's yes, that's okay. So you have done lectures on this topic all around the world in many different countries, and that started with you creating a group called ARMS.
Oh, I didn't create the group. It was there already.
Right. Yeah. You joined the group.
Yep. I joined ARMS in 1989.
Right.
And it was started up around about 1984.
Okay.
ARMS at that time stood for the Australian Relinquishing Mothers Society, but they did change the name a bit later, although it was still called ARMS. And that's where I went for counselling. And I was so impressed with the counselling. It just was so beneficial to me. It really turned my life around, changed the way I thought about my whole experience. And I worked as a volunteer for ARMS for quite a number of years. I used to take phone calls from people who wanted someone to talk to. So ARMS had a phone, and they would advertise their phone number, and if people rang that number, they got a message giving my home number. So I used to take calls at home for many years, often from people who were distressed for one reason or another around adoption issues.
Yes.
And I then, because I was so impressed with the effect of the counselling on myself, I decided that I would like to work in that area if I could, to help other people the way I had been helped. So I actually returned to study in 1995 and became a social worker. And I then was employed by ARMS as their counsellor and coordinator.
Very good.
So I worked actually for 5 years as a post-adoption counsellor, mostly working with mothers, sometimes fathers, sometimes those who were adopted, sometimes facilitating reunions between adopted people and their family members. Sometimes brothers and sisters got involved, sometimes grandparents got involved.
And this is all South Australian then?
Yes.
Just all local for you, yes?
It was at that time, yeah.
Right. So, you spoke there as if it was, there was quite a lot of customers, and South Australia isn't one of the largest, most populated states here in Australia, and that's kind of alarming in a way that there's just so many just here, Okay,
well,
so
I think if I'm right, I think round about the late 60s, early 70s, there were about 1,000 babies a year being adopted in South Australia. And some of the people I was hearing from had now left South Australia and were living in other places.
Yes.
There was quite a, and some of them would contact ARMS, but then I would find out that the adoption took place in another state, so I would refer them on to somewhere else. But yes, it was very busy. It was very busy. There were lots of calls and lots of appointments, lots of clients coming in.
So what got you started doing the lectures?
Well, when I did my social work degree, I included as part of that, I did a paper on adoption. And what I did was I sort of took the counselling that I received as an example, and I expanded on that. And I looked into the background of the grief and loss that was associated with adoption, because traditionally, because the mothers who had the babies had been hidden away and also kept quiet about it themselves, they were really invisible for many years, and all the focus was on the adoptive family, who were portrayed as being a happy family. This child now has a family of its own, and everything's happy, and even if that wasn't always the case. So I focused particularly on the mothers, and there was some research already which showed that whereas with normal grief, what you would consider a normal grief situation, so if someone dies, for example, and there's nothing complicated about the situation, it was expected, what happens is that we feel very sad, we feel awful at the time. Gradually, as time goes on, you start to feel a bit better. You start to be able to manage it. You're not crying all the time. You can go back to work. You can get back to your life. You find a place for it in your life. What the research showed, the little bit of research that there was that mothers whose children were adopted actually felt worse and worse as the years went on, not better and better.
Yep.
So it was the opposite of what you might think. So I decided to explore why that might be. And there are several reasons. I mean, one is the lack of finality of the loss. When someone dies, it's final, and you've just got to get used to it. But when you've had a child that was adopted, you know that your child is probably still alive and well somewhere else.
They could be 2 blocks away, they could
Exactly.
be 2 countries away.
Exactly.
And every year, I guess, you're thinking of them getting older, and okay, now they'd be at high school, and now, hopefully they've got their first job, and I wonder if they've got a child, So, you couldn't really imagine what would be going through your head, and I guess it wouldn't stop, because there is no end. Every year they're possibly older, and that's just another thought for you,
And there's no end to it.
No.
And you're looking at other children the same age, as they're growing up, thinking, I wonder if my child is doing this or doing that, or that looks like that, or some women, are walking down the street wondering, is that my child, for years. So I wrote this paper about the grief, and the grief of adopted people also, because, as you said before, it affects some more than others, but there are some who have that sense of they belong in the adoptive family, but they don't completely belong, because they know that nobody's going to say to them, for example, you've got your daddy's eyes, or you've got your grandpa's nose, or you dance just like your mum used to when she was little, and we take that for granted in families. It happens all the time. Oh, you're going to be tall like your dad, anything like that. You've got your mum's curly hair. All those things, you get that kind of conversation in all families all the time. But when a child is adopted, they know that people aren't saying those things to them. And there's a sense of sort of discomfort around that. We actually don't know who you look like. We have no idea if your daddy was tall. We don't know if your hair might be curly. All that unknown stuff.
I mean, even if they weren't told that they're adopted, that would just be part of the distancing that they would feel, like you're saying with the other guy and the birthdays. It just didn't feel like it was. He sensed it, and that would be. It might not be something that would pick up on initially and go, hey, how come they never tell me I've got someone's eyes? But it would just be that part that's missing. And they would sense, because, children are quite intuitive, especially to their parents and what's going around them. That's how they learn,
And if the child did know they were adopted, well, they might be thinking that themselves. They might hear other families talking like this, and they might be thinking to themselves, I wonder who I look like. I wonder whose eyes I've got. I wonder if I'm going to be tall, or if I'm going to be sporty, or if I'm going to be musical. You know, whose talents am I going to inherit? So I wrote this paper about the grief and loss and why it's sort of never ending, and why it can actually get worse instead of better, and what makes it different from the usual types of grief that we suffer. And I presented it as a paper at a conference, an adoption conference in Brisbane in 1997. And after I presented the paper, people started coming up to me and saying, "Oh, that was great, where can I buy your book?" And I just laughed and said, "There is no book. I don't have a book. I'm not a book writer. I've just done this paper, that's all." And people were saying, "You should write a book. You should write a book." So I came back home thinking, I wonder if I could write a book, and if I did, what would it be like? And I was still working, of course, you know, working full time, and had a family, and I thought, well, I'll sort of see what I can do. So I just started expanding what I had in the paper, and working on it and looking up more research, and it grew into a book. And I published that book in 2000. That's 15 years ago, which is a bit amazing to me. It doesn't seem that long ago, but I published it then. And I wrote the book for three reasons, I suppose. One was for those who had experienced the adoption, so for the mothers and fathers and the children who were adopted. I wrote it for them to try and explain to them why they might be feeling the way they're feeling, and what they can do about that, because it's not just a case of saying, this explains why you feel the way you do. It's also about what can you do to empower people to say, well, you don't have to put up with this if you're feeling miserable all the time. There are things you can do about it. Because not everybody can find a counsellor that understands about adoption. Very, very few social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, doctors, very few of them have any idea of this stuff, believe me.
And I guess that's where it became probably a lot easier for you, because you experienced it and then became a social worker. So, I mean, it's the age-old stories. You can tell somebody something over and over, but unless they live it, it generally doesn't sink in the same. And that's where I guess it is hard for the social working side of it. So I guess you'd have to hope there's a lot more people like yourself out there. We might just quickly take a break for a sec, and we should be back.
Informed Planet Radio.
Bringing you truth, news, and music.
Informed Planet Radio.
Where with your input, we create a more informed planet.
Informed Planet Radio.
Hello, welcome back to Informed Planet Radio. I've been talking today with Evelyn Robinson, adoption activist, and we've just been discussing why Evelyn's written her book, her first book, which was also self-published too, which is an impressive feat within itself this day and age, I think. But I'll let you continue on with that story.
Yes. Well, the reasons that I wrote my first book were, first of all, for those who had experienced adoption separation, so that they could understand their experience, and if they couldn't get help from professionals, they could use it as a self-help manual. I also wrote it hoping that professionals would read it, so, you know, social workers, counsellors, psychologists, so that they would have a better understanding of adoption issues, so that if people came to them for help, they would actually be able to be more useful to them. And I wrote it to educate the community in general. Because mothers had traditionally kept quiet for so long, a lot of people still don't really understand about their experience and about what things were like then, what the pressures were, how so many children came to be adopted. So I wrote it as an educational tool, really. And I did self-publish it. I tried for 18 months to get someone to publish it, and only I have a whole file full of rejection letters. only one publisher was interested at all, and they wanted me to make major changes to the book, which I just wasn't prepared to do.
No.
What they said was, what I did in the first book was I wrote my own experience as an example, because I know everybody's experience is different, but there were a lot of commonalities.
Yes.
And then I wrote what I had learned as a social worker about the loss and the grief and what might be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And the publisher said to me, we can't publish a book that has a personal memoir and then, some academic explanation. And I said, well, why not? And they said, because no one's ever done that before. And I said, well, I think that's a good reason to do it.
Oh, yeah.
And they said, well, we could publish your story, but only if you change it and make it this and that. And I said, no, forget it.
Well, what kind of changes were they asking? I mean, were they asking, like, from a professional point of view as a someone who knows the adoption field, or were they wanting to change the story so it seemed more dramatic or
Absolutely.
Hollywood?
That's what they wanted.
Really?
That's what they wanted. They wanted more drama. They wanted me to sort of jazz it up a bit. They wanted more emotion. They wanted drama,
How about the truth?
Yeah,
How
exactly.
about just the truth? That's it. Yeah.
That's it, exactly.
Okay, I think the truth is enough in itself anyway. I don't think it needs to be embellished any.
Yeah.
I think it needs to be relatable.
Yeah.
And I mean, because no one relates to a Hollywood story,
Well,
really. So.
Yeah. So 15 years ago, it wasn't easy to self-publish a book. There was no print on demand like you have now. I mean, anybody can publish anything now. You go, you make a Kindle. You can make a Kindle book of anything.
Course, yes, yeah.
It's so easy now to print through Amazon. What they do is that somebody orders a book and they just print them one and send it to them.
Yep.
So I couldn't do that. What I had to do was borrow the money and print a whole stack of books.
Yep.
And then try to sell them to get my money back, to pay back the money I had borrowed to print them. So it was a very different experience in those days.
So what was the response like for that first book?
Oh, very good. There had never been any, well, as the publisher said, nobody had ever written a book like that before.
Yeah.
And so, yes, I got a great response. I sold a lot of books.
Very good.
I created my own website and I sold the books from my website. And then so you asked me before about lecturing and travelling. People started to invite me to speak after I'd published the book, to invite me to speak in different places. So I set off with the book, and I did a tour in 2001. I spoke in New Zealand, and I went to the United Kingdom and Ireland and Canada and the United States. And I took books with me and I sold them as I went along. I didn't charge any fees for speaking anywhere that I went. I said, I'm not going to give you a bill. I just want the opportunity to give this information to people, to sell my books. And selling my books paid for my airfare. So the trip was cost neutral. So it didn't cost me anything, but I didn't make any money out of it, and that was what I wanted. I was happy with that. But on that tour, of course, a lot of other questions arose in discussions with people, because some of the people I was talking to were people who'd had an adoption experience, and others were groups of professionals. I spoke to social workers, psychologists, government workers, who were working in the adoption area. So a lot of questions were raised and issues came up. So when I came back, I realised that there was still a whole lot of information that I needed to get out there. That was how I felt. So I wrote another book. I spent the next 3 years working on my second book. I published that, and then I did the same thing. I did a tour with that book as well, on the same way as I did the first time. And since then, I've been invited to various places, I guess mostly through the internet, because now people Google me on the internet and they find work that I've done, my papers and books, my website. And the first place I was invited to that I can remember was to Romania. There was a major international conference in Romania, and I was invited to speak there. And of course they paid my expenses because I was a keynote speaker.
Bonus.
And I was the only speaker from outside of Europe.
Okay.
And they must have really wanted me there because they paid for me to come all the way from Australia to go to Romania.
Yep.
So that was a great opportunity to talk to lots of people in Europe who were working in the area of adoption.
And that went well, I see?
That went very well, yes. And I was invited to meet with the Secretary of State for Adoptions in Romania, which I did while I was there, and talked to them a lot about what things are like in Australia and what we've done here.
Yep.
And Australia really is very advanced in this area compared to a lot of other places. So they were happy to learn from, what had happened here. And with my first book, as you said before, having the personal experience and the professional made it unique.
Yes.
And so a lot of people have found it very helpful for that reason. Actually, I did an interview just a few weeks ago with a Scottish newspaper, and the journalist asked me why did I think that I had been able to, be influential. And I said, I think it's because I've had the personal experience and I've got the professional knowledge and experience as well. And there's no one else that I can think of, in the adoption world that has both of those combined. And I think that's why so many people have been willing to listen to me, which is
great.
Great.
That combination would be, most effective in most topics and categories, especially for social working and help and stuff. To have the personal experience and the professional experience, that be the kind of person that you would want to go see. It doesn't matter what field it's in, what area it's
That's
in.
Right. Because often you're trying to explain to
how
somebody,
else do you relate? That's right.
and you're probably thinking, well, you've no idea how I feel, But to go to somebody who actually has been through the same experience you've been through and also has the qualifications and experience to be able to help you, I think is very valuable.
So you're up to book 4 now?
Yes. My third book is, in the second book I put a lot of the questions I had been asked on my travels, so there's a lot of question and answer sections.
Okay.
And then the third book is largely a sort of condensed version of the first 2, with some new information added.
You're always learning as you go, so why not keep putting that information out?
Yeah. And the other thing is that I know there are some people who are not great readers and they will not sit down and read through essays or whatever. So with the third book, I put it in sort of short, small chunks of information, so that you can open it anywhere and read a bit here and read it. You don't have to read it from start to finish.
Be a good
and
reference
it's in
book
short
then.
sections.
Yep.
It's an easy read. It's not too academic. It's practical.
Okay.
It's a sort of a handbook.
Okay.
And then the fourth book, as I said before, is the collection of people's experiences, because I realised with my travels, I had talked to mothers, especially in so many different places, and there were so many similarities in their experiences.
Yep.
I think it would be good for the world to know that, for mothers in Scotland to know that mothers in America went through very much the same experience as mothers in New Zealand and mothers in Canada and mothers in Australia. So I was very appreciative of the women who gave me their stories, and a couple of men too, a couple of fathers also gave me their stories about their children being adopted. The other place that I was invited to in recent years was South Korea.
Okay.
And again, I'm just trying to remember how they found out about me. Must have been through the internet, I suppose.
How else do you find about somebody these days?
I got this invitation to be keynote speaker at a conference in South Korea at a women's university there. And again, they paid all my expenses, of course. And they were very interested in the history of adoption in Australia, and especially the fact that the number of adoptions has dropped dramatically since the early 70s.
Okay, yep.
And they were very interested in that. And also on my thoughts they were also interested in my thoughts on intercountry adoption, because South Korea has lost almost 250,000 children to intercountry adoption.
Mm-hmm, yep.
And they have pretty much put a stop to that now, compared to the numbers in the past.
And that would make it even harder again to find, you know, your parents, your original parents, or children, or whichever way you're looking.
That's right, because you've got the language barrier.
And you've also got the brothers and sisters. I mean, you might have a single child, you know, who has two parents, and one of them parents has adopted a child out. Now, sometimes single children always seek a brother or a sister, or you know, look for their face in someone else. So even for them to know there is possibly another brother or sister out there that they don't know, and then you've also got the grandparents. How did they feel? How do they feel now, learning all this stuff, and knowing that, you know, that they help to encourage their own child to give up their grandchild, and I mean, it you know, there's a larger, I mean, families, not just two people as well. You know what I mean? I know that the extent of the grief wouldn't be, you know, that far as well, but there's still the question, you know, on the other family's mind as well.
That's true. Grandparents often are very affected. Sometimes it was their first grandchild, and sometimes they look back and they say, how could we have let that happen, or how could we have made that happen? You know,
we would have got through.
Yeah,
you know, we know, and now we look back on our life and what we've done, and so we could have taken on another child. We could have helped. I mean,
at the time it seemed like the end of the world, but actually, they could have managed, and maybe it would have been fine with hindsight. But they were so much a part of the whole society's
how they grew
attitudes.
up as well, and
that's right. It was so much ingrained. It was so ingrained in people.
It is hard to change the mind of an old dog, as they say. But so you've also recently went to Canberra to pick up an award as well?
No, not to pick up an award. No. Yes, I did go to Canberra. What happened in recent years? There were calls for an apology. As you know, in Australia, we had the apology to the stolen generations.
Yes. Yep. So we're talking about the Aboriginal children.
That's right.
From here in Australia, where they were sort of just forced out of their families because they lived in an Aboriginal family, and you know, put into either homes for children or directly into a white person's family, and basically had their heritage and everything thrown out the window, and told that they must act and speak and behave like a white person. So this is the stolen generation, which has actually been quite famous and popular around the world, I'd have to say, by now. I think everybody knows what the Australian stolen generation was, and the apology that eventuated.
Yeah. Well, there was an inquiry. The inquiry started in 1995, and the report was tabled in 1997, and it was called the Bringing Them Home report. And John Howard, the Prime Minister at the time, kept refusing to issue an apology. But Kim Beazley, who was the opposition leader at the time, said that he thought there should be an apology. And I actually wrote a letter to our local Sunday Mail here in South Australia in 1997, commenting on what Mr. Beazley said. And I agreed with him. I said, I too weep for the Aboriginal children who were taken from their families, and I also weep for the parents of those children who will grieve their loss for the rest of their lives. And then I went on to talk about the losses experienced by mothers whose children were adopted. And I said, growing up in a single-parent family on a was seen as such a disadvantage that children were taken from their mothers to be adopted. Does anyone weep for our children, and can we expect an apology? So
So it doesn't matter which culture or heritage or which nationality and background you are. It's happened, everywhere. Difference being is, I guess, with your situation, it was encouraged to be done in that manner. With the Aboriginals, they were, I guess, literally stolen or kidnapped and forced. Which is, I guess, why they felt that the apology, you know what I mean, meant a bit more, in that situation.
So the apology for the stolen generations was in 2008, and then in 2009 we had an apology for the forgotten Australians, who were those who were brought up in care, mostly in institutions. And also for the former British child migrants, the British children who were sent out to Australia without their parents' permission, and a lot of them were put in institutions here, or they were made to work. So they received their apology in 2009. And after that, there was even more activism, I guess, from the adoption community to say, well, what about us?
Yes,
Our children were taken from us, and some people had difficulty with it was eventually called the forced adoptions apology. Some people had difficulty with the word forced because, as you say, with the stolen generations, the children were literally kidnapped, literally taken.
Yeah.
With our children, it was a bit different. Society persuaded us that we had to do the right thing.
Yeah.
And so
But
the term...
in the minds of yourself and other mothers like yourself, you wouldn't have felt like it was a choice, surely.
Well...
I mean, there's, it's either, take your child and go live on the streets in a cardboard box, or you just go back home like normal and we'll give your child to a really good family. It doesn't, the way that they would have put it towards you, so it wouldn't have really felt like there was any choice. And if you did make the other choice, you wouldn't have thought you were doing the right thing, surely, It is a coercion.
Yeah.
And that is, when it's persuaded so vigorously, I'd say it's forced.
Well, that's what a lot of people think. When someone says to you, you want to do what's best for your child, don't you? What are you going to say? You're not going to say no.
No,
So
that's right.
the expression that I've used is forced by circumstances. Because there, as I said, there was then sort of activism for an apology for past adoptions.
Yeah.
There was an inquiry into that.
Is the apology? Are you seeking the apology from government or from church, or does that make a difference? Are you just happy with the apology? We haven't got this apology yet.
Yes,
either.
yes.
Oh, we have got this apology.
Yeah, we've had the
apology. And where did it come from then?
From the federal government.
Right. Okay.
Initially, the federal government said, it's not our problem because it was all managed under state law. So you have to go to the states. So actually, the states did apologise, first of all.
Right.
And then that put a lot more pressure on the government to apologise for their role in being behind it all. When did this happen then? 2 years ago.
Right.
2013.
Well, what about the church? Is there any cause to seek?
Some of the churches have issued apologies just sort of in the press. They've said, yeah, we're sorry for what happened and for the role we played in that. So there have been some apologies from some of the churches. But the federal government one was obviously the most powerful one.
Yep. Absolutely.
And that was issued by Julia Gillard. So leading up to that, there was a reference group. And then after the apology, when the apology was given 2 years ago, on the 21st of March 2013, there was also an allocation of funding. to provide counselling, to provide training for professionals, and
Very good.
to provide an exhibition at the National Archives which would tour Australia.
Yep.
So then a group was put together to assist the government in using that funding, and I was appointed to be a member of that group.
Okay.
So that involved a lot of visits to Canberra for meetings.
Right.
Now that has now stopped because the spending has all been allocated. Not everything has been completed, but the plans have all been put in place now, so the group doesn't exist anymore. But I was in Canberra recently for the launch of the exhibition at the National Archives, and I met former Prime Minister Julia Gillard there, which was a bit exciting. And the exhibition is excellent. They have taken contributions from people who from mothers, fathers, family members, those who were adopted, from adoptions that took place in Australia and even outside Australia, and they've put it all together, and that is now going to come to every capital city in Australia over the next couple of years, I think.
So
it's going to travel around.
Most people like to question what the government's spending their money on and how they spend it. Are you happy with the way that the money was allocated for this and how much was spent and what's being done? Do you think there could be more, or?
Well, there certainly could have been more money. It's always good when government recognises a need and put some funding into it. So there certainly was a need, I believe, for more services, and so that is going to happen. There was a need for training for professionals, and that is going to happen. I don't really want to get into whether it was done in the best possible way or not.
Well, I don't think that anything can be perfect when you're trying to deal with with money in society, and you can't please them all.
Exactly.
You couldn't possibly create a budget for a country that's going to please everybody all the time, and I couldn't imagine having to do it. But as long as you don't feel that they only gave a quarter or something, or a very minimal amount of what was truly needed, as long as you're feeling that what they've done is a very good step in the right direction. Hopefully more. I mean, obviously, you'd want more funding and stuff. But will it make an impact? Is it enough to make a difference and really get things going?
I would say yes, it's enough to make a difference.
Yep.
I'm particularly pleased that there's going to be training for professionals, because there's been a great need for that for a long time. Countless people have come to me and said, I spoke to my doctor about this, they sent me to a psychiatrist or a psychologist, I spoke to a social worker about this, and they just have no idea, they couldn't help me at all. And people are always asking me, can you refer me to somebody who knows this stuff, who knows what they're doing? And so I'm very pleased that there is going to be training for professionals, and I hope that...
So this is specific training for people to specifically work in this adoption grief sort of area,
yes.
Not extra training for existing doctors?
No, it is actually extra training. So it will be offered to doctors, psychologists, social workers, psychiatrists who may see a patient or a client who has adoption-related issues, so that they can then say, look, I know a bit about this stuff, I can hopefully help you with this.
Yep, that makes sense. Okay. That's good. That's good.
And I'm very happy with the exhibition. I think the exhibition's a great thing, and especially the fact that it will be touring around the country, and hope that it gets lots of publicity so that people will actually go there and learn about this stuff and be educated and see people's actual experiences and see them as real people and not just statistics.
Yes.
And listen, I mean, there are interviews, and there's a website. I mean, people can look at it now on the National Archives website, and there are interviews on the website which are very moving, where you can actually see people sitting there talking and telling you what happened. And I think that's very powerful. So I'm very happy that they've done that.
Very good.
There certainly has been some controversy about the funding for additional services. But my view is there was funding, there are additional services, and the more services we have, the more options people have. It gives people more choices and more opportunities. Obviously, there are more people now who will need to be trained, but that training is being created as well.
And in the end, it's going to hopefully create a happier society,
Yes,
more aware and contempt, and an open-minded society as well.
Yeah.
That's great. So your books are available from your website.
I don't sell them myself from the website now.
Right.
They're sold through Amazon.
Okay. What is your website?
My website address is www.clovapublications.com, and Clova is CLOVA.
Yep. Okay.
And on the website there's information about my work, and there are lots of articles on there people can download. There's no cost or anything. And I also have a mailing list. People can add their name to my mailing list. I send out anything I come across of interest with regard to adoption from time to time. But yes, my books are available on Amazon, and they're available as e-books, as Kindle books through Amazon.
Okay, very good. Is there anything else that you would like to get out there to the public?
I'd just like to let people know that the rest of the world is really interested in what's happening in Australia and what has happened in Australia. And there are moves now for a similar apology to ours in the United Kingdom. There's a group there who are lobbying for an apology. People have seen what has happened in Australia, and they think it's great. They think Australia is really, really leading the world in this stuff, in increasing awareness and actually taking responsibility. So our government has taken responsibility and apologised, and we're very proud of that. And we're proud of the fact that the rest of the world is interested in that. And I personally would love to see an apology in the United Kingdom. That's where I come from and where my child was born. And I think if the government there did apologise, I would want to be there for that.
Okay, yep.
The other issue, which we may keep for another time, I'm not sure, and that is really what's happening with adoption now, and now and in the future, and whether or not we have learned from the mistakes of the past.
Well, would you like to take a break and come back and talk about that, or would you would you like to come back another time and talk about that?
I think we could maybe do that another day.
Yes, that's fine with me. That's
Is that
fine.
all right?
Yes,
Yeah.
no, you're welcome back anytime.
Yeah.
Yep. All right, well, we'll wrap it up here. Thanks, guys, for listening to Informed Planet, and thank you, Evelyn, for joining us here and telling us about your life story and everything you've done, and thank you as well for the work that you've done to help with these apologies and to change things. Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
No problem.
Informed Planet Radio.
Informative talk back.
Special guests.
The truth behind the lies. Your input.
Your music.
Our planet.
My planet.
IP Radio.
Sit back. Get ready for another informative session in the live room.
You're on IP Radio.
Hello, welcome to the live room on Informed Planet Radio. My name's Fred, and I have back with me again adoption activist Evelyn Robinson.
Hello, nice to be back.
Good. So today we're going to be discussing the future of adoption, the laws, and where we're going now, and what's next, basically. So last week we discussed a little bit about Evelyn's past and her history and her personal life involved with adoption, and other people's experiences that they've shared with Evelyn. So, what is next for adoption then?
Well, as most people would realise, adoption has changed a lot since my son was adopted in 1970. And one of the major changes, or one of the major reasons, was that in 1973, the federal government in Australia introduced what came to be known as a sole parent pension. So there used to be a widow's pension, but it was only available to a woman who had been married and her husband had died.
Mm-hmm.
But after 1973, the government made it available to any mother, any woman who was raising a child on her own.
Mm-hmm.
And that immediately, almost immediately, that was brought in. The number of adoptions started to drop dramatically,
Mm-hmm.
which just goes to show that a lot of the issues around single mothers raising children were financial issues. It just it just almost was impossible
Yep.
Without that.
Without any benefits from the government.
Yeah.
What can
That's
they do?
right.
Yep.
So
And they wouldn't have had a lot of childcare back then, I don't
no,
assume, not
no,
like they do now.
that's right.
You know, and with all the subsidies and stuff like that as well.
Yeah. Generally, childcare was provided by friends and family if you
Yeah,
had people
yeah.
who were available.
Yep.
So once the sole parent pension was introduced, mothers could then actually spend time bringing up their children,
Mm-hmm.
and the number of adoptions, as I said, dropped dramatically.
So this is in Australia.
This is in Australia,
Yeah.
but it did happen in other places too, round about the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And it was partly to do with, in Australia you had the Council for the Single Mother and Her Child, and they really campaigned for the sole parent pension.
Right.
You had the feminist movement, the women's movement as well, who were saying, mothers are important to children, we should be supporting mothers. And you also had, after the 60s and the early 70s, religion was beginning then to become less powerful in people's lives, and those sort of rigid religious attitudes were less important to people.
Yep.
So it was a range of factors. So by the late 70s, already there were very few children being adopted. Those who wanted to adopt, therefore, then started looking for children from other countries. So from the sort of mid to late 70s, Australia started adopting children in from other countries. It started round about the end of the Vietnam War, 1975.
Yep.
They brought babies over from Vietnam. And
But
then,
there probably was a lot of parentless babies from over there at that
there's
period.
actually a lot of controversy around that, what they called Operation Baby Lift. What they are saying now is that those babies were not at risk, and that people acted very quickly. It was a panic situation. There was a war, and people they didn't know what to do. But in actual fact, a lot of people now are saying that shouldn't have happened. Interestingly, you mentioned that an article was published on the Conversation online this week by Tricia Fronek called "Your Child is Missing. Would you want adoption to be easier?" And what she's saying is, and this is now, that in a lot of other countries, children are going missing and they're being separated from their families for a range of reasons. And our current government wants to make it easier for Australians to adopt those children. But what if that was your child? What if your child went missing and you suddenly found that another family had adopted your child and you couldn't get them back?
No, but I mean, yes, well... and in what circumstances are they going missing? Are these being like taken away from the family, or are we just talking about missing from the streets and abducted?
Well, that is happening. Children are being trafficked.
Yes.
So they are being abducted.
Yep.
I know a woman who adopted 2 children from India. She's written a book about it, only to discover that they had been stolen.
Yeah.
And she returned to India and met with the family, and they found out the whole truth about what had happened.
Wow.
There are also, in some countries where there's a lot of poverty, parents actually will take their children to an orphanage on a temporary basis because they're not coping.
Yes.
And their plan is to go back and get them when
Yep.
things pick up, when
Yep.
they're managing better.
Okay.
And they've never consented to the children being adopted.
Yep.
But when they go back to get them, they find that their children have been taken
Yeah.
to another country, and they'll
Now,
never see them
you
again.
would think that it would take the parent's signature or some form of consent from the parents. I mean, obviously this isn't being done legally, as you say. But, you know, even for the person receiving the child, you know, surely there's a process in place for them, and they'd expect a process to be in place unless they know they're receiving the children on the black market. As you say, that family that found out that their children had been, you know, stolen, that she'd adopted out from South Africa?
India.
India. So she would have had to, or at least expected to, go through a procedure with documents and a legal procedure. Are they just forged papers then?
Well, in some places there is a lot of corruption, and of course corruption goes hand in hand with money.
Yes.
There is money involved, and there is child trafficking, and there is corruption, and very often the parents who are adopting the children have no idea that everything is not above board. But the concerning thing is that our current government wants to make adoptions quicker and easier, which is a real worry, because actually we should be making it harder, in the sense that we should be examining everything around the adoption and the child to ensure that there is no corruption, that there is no forging of signatures, that the parents, if they can be found, have actually consented. So making it quicker and easier has the potential to support corruption and trafficking.
Yeah. Yep.
It's a complex area.
Yep. If it's quicker and easier to adopt from here in Australia, then they're going to be pushing kids this direction.
Exactly.
It's not going to be all of a sudden, you know, families are adopting more. It's all of a sudden there's going to be children, you know, pushed towards us, and then families will adopt more, because they'll, you know, I mean, a lot of them assume that these children are homeless, are parentless, and if you do think about it, how many parents out there are being killed and leaving, you know, whole families, just, you know, children just sitting in the house by themselves? How common really could that be?
Exactly. And
you know,
people talk about, Mr. Rabbit unfortunately talks about millions of orphans around the world, and that's absolute nonsense. There are not millions of orphans around the world. In some countries, they label a child an orphan just because the parents are too poor to look after them for the time being. But they may have grandparents, they may have aunts and uncles or brothers and sisters.
and that's
the
where
parents,
you put funding and help in to help the parents cope, to stay with their child instead of paying or receiving money to move that child on.
Exactly. We are a very wealthy country, and we do a lot in foreign aid, but what we could also do is we could be sending people to these places to teach them the sorts of methods we have here for supporting families and keeping families together, and working within their own cultural ways of living and supporting families, not trying to impose our style of doing it on them, but
to
supporting
merge,
them to merge that and to bring the communities together so that they help each other. Because to take children from other countries, it's a terrible drain on that country. We're taking away their future. You know, I think I mentioned in the last interview South Korea. Nearly 250,000 children have been adopted out of South Korea.
Wow.
Now that's a whole generation of that. You know, that's that country's future.
And where are all the parents for these children?
Yes.
They can't all just be dead from landmines.
Exactly.
You know.
And what actually?
It's a lot of children.
It's a lot of children. The vast majority of those children were born to unmarried mothers.
Yeah.
And they had a similar sort of experience to the experience of mothers of my generation, in that unmarried mothers are still looked down upon in South Korea and encouraged to give their children up for adoption. It's happening less and less now, and one of the major reasons that it's happening less and less in South Korea is that children who were adopted out of South Korea, who are now adults, have gone back there.
Mm-hmm.
They've discovered all of this. They found their families.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I
mean, quarter of a million. There'd be several that want to know
absolutely
their history. They want to know their culture. Want to know their
and they actually lobbied
heritage.
the South Korean government and said this is appalling.
Yeah.
And they feel that it makes South Korea look bad. They say we're not a third world country.
Mm-hmm.
We're a stable. We have a stable economy. We're a modern country.
Mm-hmm.
It's ridiculous that we should be exporting thousands and hundreds of thousands of children. It's got to stop.
Yeah.
And they've been very influential in South Korea.
Good.
In other countries, poverty is more of an issue and health issues. But as you say, countries like Australia could help. We're not helping by taking their children.
I mean, it doesn't even have to be help with money. Like as you said, it's help with knowledge.
Yeah. Education and support, ideas, suggestions, and building them up. In 2010, I presented a paper at a symposium at Monash University in Melbourne, and my paper was called "Are We Creating Another Stolen Generation?" Mm-hmm. And what I said was, we've had these apologies in Australia. We talked last time I spoke with you about the stolen generations. Mm-hmm. So years ago, as most people now in Australia would know, Aboriginal children were taken from their families and brought into, the white culture, whether they were adopted into non-Aboriginal families or placed in homes and orphanages. Mm-hmm. They were taken away from their language, their families, their culture. They lost all of that. Mm. And as a nation, we've acknowledged that. We've apologised for that and said it was wrong. We shouldn't have done it. We've acknowledged those losses. We've also acknowledged the losses of the British child migrants, the children that were brought out from Britain. Mm-hmm. Again, they were taken away from their country, from their culture, from their families, brought to a strange place, and often not very well looked after. No. And also without the parents' consent. We've apologised to the forgotten Australians who were moved from their families and brought up in care. How can people not see that by bringing children from other countries into Australia, we're repeating the mistakes of the past?
Yes.
I find this very frustrating that people are not making those connections.
Yeah.
If it was
we're
wrong,
getting apology over apology for doing it, and then turn around and go, but, there is these lots of kids there, and someone could make a lot of money. Let's bring them in.
Well, actually, at an adoption conference in 2012, adopted people who had been adopted into Australia from other countries asked if they could be included in the adoption apology, which took place in 2013. And at the time, they were refused because people said, well, that's a different issue. I firmly believe that we will one day be apologising to those children that we adopted into Australia from other countries, because they have had exactly the same experience. They've been taken from their families, from their culture, their language, their country, and brought to a strange place. And the apology in 2013 was for forced adoptions. For every child who's adopted, that's a forced adoption, because the child didn't make that decision. Yes. The decision was forced upon the child. Yep.
And if you ask the child, what the child's going to say? I want to stay with mum and dad.
Well, most children.
I'm sure there's abusive parents and parents that they don't want to stay with.
Well, a lot of children, even with abusive parents, want to stay with them.
That's true. They then just need help instead of taking the child and taking to a stranger. And when as you said, when that's the option of a stranger or your abusive parents, you're probably still going to choose your abusive parents because there's still going to be some connection, some love. There's still your parents. As opposed to a stranger, which could just abuse you as well.
Sadly that does happen too. That's a whole other issue, but that does happen too. So it frustrates me greatly that people, as I said, do not make those links, that they can't see that to me it's the moral thing to do, to support those countries and try to help them to build up their families and strengthen their family ties, not destroy their family ties by taking their children and bringing them here. and repeating the mistakes of the past. That's what, at one time, people thought it was the right thing to do with Aboriginal children.
Yeah, yeah.
And now everybody says that was a terrible thing to do. How
Yeah.
could we have done that?
Yeah, and they were dead set that it was the right thing to do as
Absolutely.
well. It
Yeah.
wasn't, I mean, that was the majority of the way of thinking.
It was. But people now
Yeah.
are starting to question inter-country adoption a lot more. They're starting to say, hey, we are repeating the mistakes of the past. This cannot be the best outcome for these children. There must be a better way, and we have a responsibility to these other countries to support them.
What kind of people are adopting these children then? Are we looking at people who feel sorry for the children and feel that these children need a home and don't understand where they're coming from? Or are we looking at people who are infertile and having problems having children? Because from what I see is the infertile ones are looking more at the IVF and trying to have their own children before adoption more these days,
I don't think there's ever been any research on the adoptive parents and sort of, categorising them in that way. In the past, traditionally, it was adoptive parents who couldn't have children of their own, who wanted to adopt. There have always been people who have felt that they had a sort of a moral duty to look after orphan children and try to help out, even if they could have their own children, that they have felt that it would be a good thing to do to adopt a child who was homeless. That attitude is less prevalent nowadays because of, as I say, studies like the Stolen Generation. People are starting to realise, hey, there are better ways I can help. That's not necessarily the
So
best
instead of
answer.
taking the child away
Yeah.
and raising it yourself, you could maybe go into the community and help those parents
Yeah.
raise their children, whether it's just by helping them with some school clothing or something like that, or helping them around the house and dishes, and just being around them will teach them, the morals that as well, just in general conversation,
Yeah. At that symposium I spoke at, there was a speaker called Indigo Willing, who was adopted from another country into Australia. And she talked about the cost of adopting a child from Ethiopia.
Right.
So people are paying thousands of dollars to adopt children from other countries. The cost of adopting a child from Ethiopia could actually support 60 children in Ethiopia
Wow.
up to the age of 18 until they become adults.
Wow.
So rather than paying for one child to bring here,
Yeah.
you could use that same money and allow 60 children to grow up safe and
Yes,
well in their
their
home
own
country,
country.
in Ethiopia, among
Yep.
their own people.
Yep. No, that's a huge difference. That's saving 1 to 60.
Yes.
And I guess if you choose that one, then I guess it's for selfish benefits.
Well,
If you know that difference now, if you know what after hearing something like this, and you know what your money can do, and you choose the other.
well, I wouldn't like to judge.
I'll judge. I don't mind.
I spoke at an event in Canada one time, and there was a chap there, and he said, friends of mine have just adopted a child from Romania. This boy was about 7 or 8 years old. He has a family. He has parents and he has brothers and sisters, but they're very poor. And so he thought, his friends said, we'll bring him to Canada and we can give him everything, we can spend all this money on him and he'll have a great life, much better life than he would have had in Romania. And I said, so he has a family, he has parents, he has a home, he has siblings, and they're bringing him here. If they sent half the money they've spent to adopt the child and bring him here and sent it to the family, they wouldn't need to give away their child.
Yeah.
If poverty is the issue,
Yep.
then why don't they give them money to, send them a weekly allowance so they
Yes.
can feed their children? And he looked at me and he said, oh, I never thought of that.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, how do you pick one? I mean, there's a family there. They're all starving. They're all poor. He's got other siblings and parents. And I just get, well, look, I'll just take you and, give you a great life. And I'll just forget about the others. we'll just forget they even exist. You don't need to postcard them. No. You'll be too busy playing on water slides and stuff.
Actually,
how do you pick? You know,
that reminds me of my neighbour. When I lived in Scotland, I had this next door neighbour. She was an older woman, and she was a twin, and there were 7 children. Once the twins were born, that made 7 children in the family. She and her twins were the youngest, and they were quite poor. You know, this was going back a bit, and her mother had a sister who couldn't have children. And when the twins were born, this sister said to her mother, "Look, you've got all these children and you can hardly afford to feed them, and I haven't got any children. Now you've got twins, as if you haven't got enough. Why don't you give me one of the twins to bring up?" So she reluctantly agreed because they were poor. And so this aunt and uncle brought up my neighbour. So she was brought up as an only child. And they gave her everything. She always had beautiful clothes, toys, everything. And there was her 6 siblings, including her twin sister. And she knew, everybody knew, because of course it was family, there were no secrets. But she said, they all hated me. My brothers and sisters all hated me because I had everything and they were so poor. She said they never accepted me as part of the family. I was very lonely. I was an only child, and it didn't matter how many pretty dresses I had and how many toys I had. What I wanted was to be part of the family. And they took that from me. I was lonely. I was never accepted by my own family. Which what you said just reminded me of that. It was so sad. I thought it was so sad. And that was even within the family.
I mean, uncles and aunties can help out, you know, their nephews and nieces with money and stuff like that as well. I mean, it is your brother or sister's child, you know, and their family, and when it comes to it, I don't know how you could leave somebody to suffer like that, especially to choose one. I still can't get that. How do you? I'll just take you, eeny, meeny, miny, mo. I mean, or I like playing baseball, so I've always wanted a son, so I'll definitely take a boy. Or I mean, how do you just choose like that and then forget the rest? I can't get over that one.
The thing about a lot of this adoption stuff is that we've now had a lot of years experience to look at. We now have all these adopted people who are a lot older, who are adults now, and they can tell us what it's been like for them. In the early days, people didn't know this stuff. They were working in the dark, really. They were thinking, well, this seems like a good idea. Why don't you just give me your baby? Or why don't I just take that child? Seems like a good idea. Nowadays, there's no excuse, because we have all this research now. We have adopted people who are telling us what it's been like for them. So there really is no excuse for people to continue to repeat the mistakes of the past. Now, you mentioned IVF before, and surrogacy, of course, is another issue. And it's true that people nowadays, if they can, and that generally means if they can afford to, they would prefer to have a child that they have some relationship to, rather than adopt a child to which they are not related at all. So there are still people who want to adopt, but probably not quite as many as in the past. I didn't want to use the word demand. A book came out last year, I think it was, in Australia, called The Market in Babies, which was based on on some studies done in Australia, and they just really showed how the adoption market was driven by supply and demand. So that is less so nowadays, because there are other options for people. There is IVF and there is surrogacy. But what we don't know is we don't yet have the long-term outcomes for those children. So with adoption we do. Now, back in probably the 80s, there were a lot of sperm donor clinics opening up. And at that time, nearly all of them, I think, were anonymous. They were asking for anonymous sperm donors. We now have people who were created as a result of anonymous sperm donation, who are adults. They're now starting to speak out. So they're telling us how it feels for them, because they will never know who their father is.
Not at all.
And they don't have...
It's not even fighting the law for that one, is there?
No, that's right. Some of them are finding out They're going public, they're going online, they're saying, were you a sperm donor at such and such a
during
place at
this
such and such a
period,
time? You could be my
Can we
father.
get genetically tested?
But it's very hit and miss.
Yeah.
And some of the sperm donors are actually going back to the clinics and saying, look, I didn't realise at the time what I was doing,
Yes.
but now I think that's a really awful thing to have no record. I want you to take my details now, and if anybody comes and asks, I want you to tell them who I am. So
there's no laws around this thing? There's no stopping people doing this?
Oh, well, there isn't. There are now.
Right.
But there weren't then.
Right. No, but there's people going back now and handing in their details to be found. Because, I mean, with the adoption laws, it's, hit and miss. They just say that the parents can put their name down, but they can't actually search for the child. But the child, once they're 18, can then search for the parent and stuff.
In some places. It depends very much on the clinic. Unfortunately, a lot of the clinics have actually disappeared. So there is nowhere to go to give your records to in some places.
Yeah, if you talk about something that was started in the 80s.
Yeah, and some clinics don't want anything to do with it. They just don't want to hear about it.
Yeah, there'll be lawsuits.
So it's not that easy.
It's
not that easy. So we don't do that anymore. We don't do anonymous sperm donations anymore because we've learned from that.
Yep.
With IVF, there are two types of IVF. There is IVF in which the child has the genetic makeup of the two parents. So we're not talking about that because that's just assisted reproduction. So that's your own child, but you just get some help to become pregnant. But there is also IVF and assisted reproduction technologies where there are donated eggs, donated sperm, surrogacy. So the child can have genetic input from several different people.
Up to 3, I guess.
Up to 3, they're saying,
and
that's right.
That's got to do something odd to the genetics in a way. I mean, because even if you say they've got an egg from one lady and a sperm from another lady, and they're both put into a third party, that baby has to pick up genes and genetics from the third party that's hosting the baby in the belly. It's feeding it, for starters.
Yeah.
So that's,
and
what are the repercussions of that? I mean,
well, there are a lot of people who are very concerned about that. We don't have that long-term knowledge that we have with the other issues. But we could look at it and say, well, this is what adopted people are telling us. This is what the sperm donor people are telling us. So you could predict from that that there are going to be issues down the track. And
I don't think there's any adopted people out there that are happy with the situation. Really, I mean, I'm sure there's people who just don't care, not worried about their past. But I can't see any actually being, unless they know where they come from, and they themselves feel that, if they were brought up back where they were born or whatever, that they could be dead or shot in a war or something like that by now. But there could be really no happy outcome to this. The child's going to be separated from the parents. It's not like a puppy where if you have it at the age of 6 weeks old that it's more bonded towards you because it's younger. You can't get a baby at 9 months old and say, well, because it's so young it doesn't remember its parents, it's going to be more bonded to me. As you said last time, there's people out there that didn't know they were adopted and still felt that separation. There was that one guy whose his birthdays, that it was more of a solemn sort of morbid event, because there was no birth to remember. There was no carrying of 9 months. What they would remember is handing over the money and signing the form and receiving your package from the stalk.
Yeah. It's interesting that for some people their desire to have a child overrides any thoughts of the long-term repercussions for the child. And sadly, that's still the case.
Maternity instinct can be quite strong, though. It's a very, that's sort of the meaning of life in a way, is to reproduce.
To reproduce, that's right.
It would, have to be up there with breathing in your heart, pumping in a way, you know what I mean, for women, I'm sure.
Otherwise, the human race would have died out many years ago.
So, adoptions have never been done on this sort of mass kind of scale to what we know of. I mean, I'm sure that, back in the year 500 or something, when one army raided another, they generally they would normally kill off the men and take the women, leave younger children, maybe kill off some of the older boys that might remember and want to have revenge or something like that. But you don't hear of them going in and killing off all the parents and adopting the children out. They'd normally just kill the children off, I guess, if they're going to kill the parents. So it's never really been done in this kind of mass scale. I mean, 250,000 in South Korean.
The interesting thing, if you look at it historically, I mean, we don't have written history of these kind of things, way back. But for the last few hundred years, if you look back at what happened, there have always been situations where a child could not be raised within their family for whatever reason, sometimes social reasons, sometimes poverty, and sometimes another family would take the child. But I think, and as I said, we don't know about, ancient history so much, but I think family heritage and lineage have always been important to people. You even look now, all the programs on TV of Find Your Family and Who Do You Think You Are, and all the number of people around the world, myself included, who have researched their family history and spend hours and money and all, years doing all that. It's important to people. Yeah. And it's always been important. When you look at royal families, leaders, royal families, it goes through the bloodline.
Yes, yeah.
An adopted child cannot inherit a title because it goes through the bloodline. People have always been concerned about who they are, who their people are, where they come from. And in the sort of, certainly the 19th century, possibly the 18th century, I'm talking about Britain now, sometimes a child would be raised in another family, but they didn't adopt them. What they would say was, I am the guardian of this child, and they described the child as a ward sometimes. This is my ward.
Yep.
This is the child that I am bringing up. But the child knew who their people were, who they were related to, what their connections
could go visit their parents and stuff.
Maybe at least they knew. They kept their own name and they knew who they were. Nobody pretended it was their child.
And lied about it for the whole life.
Exactly. Once legal adoption came in, sort of the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, people started to conceal the truth. Because the child then was issued with a new birth certificate. And a lot of people don't understand this about adoption. When a child is adopted, their legal relationship to all their family is severed. So that child is no longer legally related to its parents, its siblings, grandparents, cousins, everybody. They're not related to them at all. They get a new birth certificate which says that the adoptive parents are the parents. This is traditionally what's happened since adoption first came in. And that allows adoptive parents to lie if they choose to, because there's your birth certificate. We're your mum and dad. It's right there in black and white. So once that started, that legal adoption came in, adoptive parents could lie and they could say, this is my child. And if they never told the child any different, nobody would know.
Do you know what the percentages would be of parents who didn't tell their children that they're adopted, as opposed to the open families with, that just sort of tell them when they come of age? Or
when I think of the people I've worked with, I would think, and this is a very rough estimate, probably about 75% of them had been told they were adopted.
Okay.
I don't think there are any statistics.
It'd be a hard lie to keep up with, but...
Well, it depends. I mean, some people I know, once they've adopted the child, they've gone and moved somewhere else. And they've made a fresh start as a family. And they've just introduced themselves, we are this family, and nobody knows any different. So that can happen.
Hard to lie when you just all of a sudden appear with a baby and you weren't pregnant for the last 9 months in the village,
Actually, there were some people in the past, there were some adopted mothers who put pillows under their dresses, and when they were waiting for a baby to adopt, they pretended they were pregnant.
Wow.
And they actually went and came back with the baby. They went to such lengths because there's been a lot of shame associated with adoption.
Yeah.
The mothers who were pregnant were shamed because they were pregnant and unmarried, but some adoptive mothers who were unable to have children felt that that was a shameful position to be in.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody expected them to have children. And there was some embarrassment and shame around the fact that they couldn't have children. They felt
And if
inadequate.
people knew it wasn't their legitimate child,
Yeah.
they might think differently of them or react
exactly.
differently, towards them and stuff.
Because years ago, people used to think the only children who were adopted were the ones who came from real lowlifes,
That's it, yeah. I mean, what would you think of that child as
yeah.
well? That,
And people would say to them, "Oh, you took in an adopted child. You don't know
Yeah.
where they've come from. They could
Yeah.
have bad genes.
Yeah.
They could turn out, they could
have
murder you in your
could
bed.
have rabies or anything.
Yeah.
Don't let them bite you.
Yeah, they used to think they could murder you in your bed.
Yeah.
You don't know where they've come from. You don't know anything about them, and
Yeah.
it's a real.
Yeah.
They thought it was a real risk.
Mhm.
And many people now are saying there should be no adoptions in future. Now, I've been saying that for many years, and now other people, are starting to say it too. And sometimes people say to me, "Well, that's a ridiculous thing." I don't think it's a ridiculous thing at all, because there was a time when there were no adoptions. So I don't see why we can't go back to a time when there are no adoptions. It's about honesty. I understand that children can't always stay with their parents because sometimes it's just not safe for them. And they have to be brought up somewhere else. But you don't have to change their birth certificate. You don't have to cut all their legal relationships with all their family members, their siblings, their grandparents, everybody.
And that's the adoption bit. It's not
Exactly.
a matter of finding a safe place for the child to grow up. It's a matter of losing their heritage.
Exactly. It's the
who
honesty.
they are. It's,
you can do that. You can care for the child in an honest way
Yep.
that acknowledges who you are. Now, I had a cousin who adopted a child, and she was married. They adopted this child. Then the adopted parents got divorced. Then she remarried, and I don't know whether her second husband readopted the child, but the child got her name changed to the stepfather's name.
Yep.
Then they got divorced again. So this young woman now has got a name that belongs to a man that she doesn't even see,
Yeah.
doesn't even know, is not related to.
Yeah.
And there's no need for that.
No.
There's no need for that. If a child needs to be cared for somewhere other than its own family, they can still know who they are.
Yes.
They can. Your birth certificate is supposed to be a record of your birth.
Yeah.
And if you change that, you're rewriting
it's just
history.
a lie. It's just a lie. Yep.
Exactly.
That's right.
There's
Yep.
no need for that. In
Yep.
the 21st century, I
Yep.
think we know better, and we should have learned from the mistakes of the past. And it's very disappointing that our current Prime Minister cannot see that. He seems to have a bit of a blind spot when it comes to
So,
adoption.
Tony Abbott we're talking about here. Has he
Yes.
brought in laws already, or is he proposing laws?
He's encouraging what he calls quicker and easier adoptions. The federal government doesn't manage adoptions. It's done by the states and territories. For local adoptions, the federal government has a connection to inter-country adoptions through the Attorney General's Department, because they oversee the granting of visas for children
Yes.
brought in from
Yep.
other countries. And I was present at the Forced Adoptions Apology in 2013 when Tony Abbott spoke. And he said all these wonderful things about how he understood about the pain of separating children from their families and how we'll never do it again. And we promise not to repeat the mistakes of the past. As soon as he became Prime Minister, he broke all those promises. All that went right out the window. And I wrote an article about that called "Trust Me, I'm a Politician." Which was my attempt at satire, I suppose. Not satire, irony, I don't know. And I outlined some of the promises that he made and broke. So some of the things he said, "I cannot imagine a grief greater than that of a parent and a child parted from each other." He also said, "I cannot imagine an ache greater than the fear that Mum didn't want me, especially since it wasn't true." He said, Hundreds of thousands of Australians have been adopted, often because their mothers had no real choice or were denied any choice. And that means there were hundreds of thousands of mothers who hardly knew their children and hundreds of thousands of children who hardly know their mothers. This is a tragedy for them and for our nation, and we must atone for it. So what does he want to do now? He wants to bring hundreds of children from other countries to Australia who will never know their mothers or their siblings or their grandmothers or their heritage or their culture, after saying it was a tragedy when we did it before.
Yeah, yep.
And he can't see that he's trying to perpetuate another tragedy. I just find it so
when did he say
frustrating.
this? It was 2013?
21st of March 2013.
Wow.
I've got his words. You can find his words on the internet. It's
Yeah.
all there for posterity. He
Yes,
can't deny he
yes,
said it.
Yeah, okay.
His speech is right there on the internet. He
Yeah.
said, "It was never simply for the best. The people who claimed that it was should have known better. Just some of them did know better, but they persisted despite the avoidable pain that was inflicted on hundreds of thousands of people. When we take children from other countries and bring them here, we're inflicting pain on those countries,
Yeah, yeah.
on those villages, on those communities, on those families by taking their children
in mass,
from
by
them."
the sounds of
Yeah,
it.
yeah. He said, "Every child deserves a mother's love and every mother has the right to raise her child." Well, now he appears to be saying, well, yeah, only some mothers do.
Yeah.
You know,
Australian
only
mothers.
Australian mothers
Australian
do.
mothers.
Yeah.
You've got to look after Australian mothers.
Yeah. And it's really patronising because it suggests that mothers in other countries, well, they don't matter so much. Their relationship with their children, they're not like us. Their relationships don't matter as much. So it's all right for us to take their children.
They're poorer, so they don't have as much love in their heart.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the suggestion. Every child deserves a mother's love, and every mother has the right to raise it. We know it now, and we should have known it then. Well,
Somebody knows it now. He's
well, he
saying
said
it,
that.
you know. Yeah.
And he said that there are big lessons here now and for the future. Part of apologising for old mistakes is striving to avoid new ones, and I will strive to avoid new ones. I don't think so, Mr. Abbott. So that's been very disappointing for a lot of us. We really thought that so many people have come forward and gone public with their experiences, both mothers, fathers, adopted people, family members. We've had inquiries where people have told of what this has done to them, the grief and the loss and the trauma, and to go through all of that and then not show that we've learned from it.
Yeah.
It's just appalling. It's I think it's embarrassing for Australia, because we were the first country in the world to apologise for past adoptions, and the rest of the world, really looks up to Australia for doing that.
Yeah.
They think it's wonderful, and they would love for that to happen in their countries too.
Yeah.
And I think I said at the last interview, I've been writing to politicians in the United Kingdom and especially in Scotland recently, trying to encourage them to follow Australia's example. But what does it do for our international reputation when we make all these promises to learn from the mistakes of the past, and then we have a Prime Minister who wants to repeat them?
Yeah. Yep.
It's not a good look,
No.
to put it mildly.
No, and especially like you say with with all the child trafficking and stuff, and lost kids, and missing children and stuff. It's actually quite common in some countries and some places, and for it to be easier to adopt them kids and just bring them here without questioning or investigating into their history or anything like that.
Well, without questioning enough, without questioning sufficiently.
Yes.
And another issue around surrogacy is that there are some people now who don't want the child to know what their heritage is and deliberately create children who will never know. And that, to me, is just incredibly selfish. That's not child-focused. They're not putting the child's interests first. The other issue about surrogacy is I'm currently reading a book, and sorry, I can't remember the exact title of it. I don't have it with me, but it's written by a Scandinavian woman, and she says that surrogacy is the little sister of prostitution. she says women are being exploited through surrogacy. Their bodies are being sold in the same way that, you know, women's bodies are sold in prostitution.
Yep.
They're putting themselves at risk, and there are all sorts of complications associated with that, which will come to light in the future. And I agree with that. I think it's tragic that women, usually because of poverty, sometimes they're under pressure, are allowing themselves to go through carrying a child for 9 months and giving birth, and then handing it over to someone else. And there are risks involved. And then we've got these awful scenarios where sometimes 2 children are born, and the people only want one of them, or just incredibly complicated.
I mean, they're just treating them like an object. I mean, the children as well. You know, like a fashion statement. You know, you know, when you see them movie stars going over there to a village and sectioning off the whole village and getting their security in there, and then just playing around with the kids and going, oh, I like that one. You know, don't care where it come from. I just like that one. You know, it's just like picking a cat out the litter. You know what I mean? It does. It objectifies
It's callous
the children, as
yeah.
well, and it says something about that person. You know, it really does say a lot about that person.
I agree.
You know, especially these multi-billionaire, you know, movie stars and stuff like that, which could actually feed the whole town, let alone the village or the orphanage.
Yeah, they could build a hospital. They could build a school.
And they just take one child and go, oh, I'm going to give this a great life. You know, and there can't be any love in that family. You know, in them families. You know.
Well,
afterwards,
a lot of it is built on what the parents want, rather than looking out for the best interests of the child.
Yeah.
And I think,
but that's selfish.
A real lack of understanding of what's important.
That's Yep.
So as far as the future goes, those of us who feel this way, just keep trying to educate people, keep speaking out about these issues, bringing it to people's attention in any way that we can, in the hope of educating the population so that they'll really think a bit more deeply about these issues, and if children need to be cared for, that they be cared for in a way that is really child-centred and meets the children's needs, all of their needs, and doesn't separate them from their family and their heritage unnecessarily, and allows them to know and to be honest, and that the whole setup is honest. In terms of birth certificates, I don't know what on earth they do with these children who, as you said before, some of them have genetic material from 3 people. I think all of that needs to be recorded somewhere, so that if these children ever want to go back and trace that genetic history, either for medical reasons or any other reason, it should be available to them. They should be able to know, you know, who was the mother who donated the egg, or who was the mother who carried them, or who was the man who donated the sperm.
In the day and age of record keeping, to keep falsifying records is a tragedy. Especially, as you say, in this modern era that, you know, we all know better, you know.
Jermaine Greer has spoken up recently because Elton John and his partner have 2 children, and apparently, this is not quite accurate, but what she's saying is that these children have a birth certificate which says Elton John is their father and this other man is their mother. And she says, well, clearly that's ridiculous. It doesn't exactly say that. What it says is, apparently,
well, you can't have 2 fathers. I mean, how could they make it make sense?
Well, how could it be an honest birth certificate? I mean, this is the question. So what I would propose is that everyone needs a legal document that says who are the people who are legally responsible for caring
the guardians,
for you, the guardians. But that's not your birth certificate. So I would propose that people need to have 2 documents.
Adoption certificate and a birth certificate.
Need to have 2 documents. One which actually has the genetic truth on it about who the people are who contributed to this child. And the other, which is the guardianship document, as you say, these are the people who have the legal responsibility for raising this child.
Yes, yep.
And sometimes they will overlap, and sometimes they will be completely different. But, you know, it is, for me, without a doubt, that in years to come, these children, when they're adult, will be jumping up and down saying, who the hell thought this was a good idea?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep.
You know, especially if they look back historically at what happened with, you know, the stolen generations and adoption and sperm, all of that. They're just going to be shaking their heads and say, how could you possibly have thought that this was the right thing to do?
Yeah.
A lot of us are shaking our heads now and wondering how people think this is the right thing to do.
Also, if you know anybody out there who is considering adoption, suggest that you get them to listen to some of the experiences of the people who have already been adopted. I'm sure that you can find some similar situations to what the people you know would be going through, and see if you can educate them about it. I'd say. Because, as you said, that's all it is it's education. It's not easy to teach people this if people aren't interested in adoption or, you know, haven't had anything to do with it. What's it got to do with them? But it's still that general knowledge that they should know to pass on down to their children. It's still, I mean, it's like that common sense type knowledge that, you know, you stop at stop signs type thing. It's like, well, okay, you don't ruin somebody's history. You don't lie about their credentials and where they came from and their birthright and stuff. And I never really thought about like that as well, that they are rewriting their history and they're lying about it and they're covering up. And I mean, I always thought that if they did it, they would still keep a record of the original. You know what I mean? I know that they give them a new birth certificate, but you would think that it would be, you know, taped to the front of the original, or the original's in the back drawer or something. But to actually wipe it from history, wipe it from the records, it's a bit harsh.
In adoption, they don't wipe it completely, but they do sometimes deny access to it. And I mean, an adopted person's original birth certificate is not a legal document.
Well,
but at least for adopted people, in most places that I know of, they can, well, not most places, but in some places they can eventually access that document.
Well, would you like to take a break, or do you think that's enough for this show?
I'm not sure that there's anything else we need to cover.
I feel we've pretty well.
I think
we've gone through it pretty well with
we have.
the fine-tooth comb. Yeah.
And I really appreciate the opportunity to get this information out there. As you said, there's a lot of people who, if their life has never been touched by adoption, they don't think about it very much. No. And they maybe accept some of the stuff that they see in the media, which is very uninformed and inaccurate a lot of the time. Yeah. So hopefully they'll listen to this and it will just open their eyes a bit and just show them a different way of looking at things. Absolutely. Well, it was a pleasure having you here. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Okay, guys, you have been listening to The Live Room here on Informed Planet with adoption activist Evelyn Robinson, and we'll see you next time.
Informed Planet Radio.
Bringing you truth, news, and music.
Informed Planet Radio.
Where with your input, we create a more informed planet.
Informed Planet Radio.